Yeah, good. Okay, I'm Peter Scarth, University of Queensland in Australia, but also the director of sort of two small startups that do, I guess, dynamic biomass for cows, total standing dry matter with SIBO Labs and Ausius, where we do basically forest structure mapping. Now, okay, so I'm just going to sort of run through, I guess, some of the retrieval processes that we use in Australia and really draw heavily on the international products. Have a look at some of the spatial variations of biomass across our environments, and just look at the dynamic nature of biomass and the implication for retrieval, particularly for, I guess, commercial and emerging applications. So this is, I guess, a SPECT forest structure map across Australia. And I guess the interesting thing here is that it's, and you see this in the global biomass maps along the east coast and in southwestern Australia, you've got the closed forest, but most of Australia is this sort of sparse savanna environment. It's grassland with sparse trees or open woodland, and they're the areas that are pretty hard to get right. You know, soil moisture plays a big part of it. It's really sparse. It's acacias, so they got dark leaves, so they're sort of hard to map. Also in Australia, we're very lucky to have this excellent biomass library that Richard had an awful lot to do with, along with John Armston. And you can see by the red points, like there's millions of hugs, and there's what, 12,000, 13,000 sites, but there's not a lot in the sparse environment as well. So it's kind of hard to build products that work well there. But we have got good calibration data along, you know, in the forests and woodlands. In terms of, I guess, cover change data, so not biomass, but data that indicates change, we've got good federal government data from the National Forest and Sparse Woody Vegetation data. It's a three-class classification, but you can imagine that sort of tipping forward, and you can generate quite a lot of classes out of that in terms of, you know, whether an area is primary or secondary forest, if it's been regrown, and how it transitions between forest, woodland, and non-woody through time. So it's a useful data set to drive temporal evolution of the landscape. We've also got quite good, I guess, greenness data. So this is a persistent green, which is basically a time series trend through a greenness fraction, sort of similar to NDVI, but calibrated against field data. And that sort of shows, or in this case here, between the years here, that, you know, we've had a lot of drought effects, and we've got some areas up north that are greening up in blue. And so it's a continuous change every, I'd call it annual, even though it comes out every 3 months. So let's just quickly run through some of the products and how they look across Australia. So, I mean, the first one is obviously the one we're looking at the moment, the CCI above ground biomass. It's the 28 product. Looks great. You can see the east coast, you get the high biomass and not, well, there's actually no retrieval at all in the center of Australia, but it captures the, you know, the dynamics, the variability pretty well. This is Jedi. You can sort of flick between them. You can see Jedi's got a lot of coverage in central Australia. It's all, you know, around 1 to 2 megagrams per hectare. But it is picking it up. There's, you know, obviously artifacts there from not enough samples, but it's also, you know, providing quite a similar pattern. We've also got Flint Pro, which is basically based on the full land integration tool, which was initially based on the full cam model. So it's a modeled biomass that uses the change data we saw earlier, along with plant growth models, to grow biomass across Australia. And the same thing is showing similar patterns. It's doing it a little bit better in the savanna regions than some of the others. Finally, here's, I guess, an evolution of a product that we did with Richard a couple of years ago. Initially, it was based on ALOS, Pulsar, and ISAT, and this is a version based on Sentinel-1 and 2 and Jedi data, and calibrated against the in situ data across Australia. And it's, I kind of like it. I think it might overdo it a little bit in central Australia, but it's sort of fairly similar to the Jedi in a lot of cases, and in most of the time there's actually are trees there. It's just very sparse. If you start looking at change between the two, that's where you start to see differences, and we sort of heard that in the previous talk. So this is the Flint Pro biomass change. You can see you probably can't see, but in the centre of Australia, you probably can't see my pointer. There's areas of land clearing that are coming up. There's some green areas, which I think are forests that are regrowing. But a lot of the patterns I find a little bit hard to interpret here. This is the biomass trend from biome, which is basically based on local cover to mass relationships through time. And it looks fairly dire along the East Coast, and that's actually all drought death from the 2019, 2020 drought that may recover. It may not be a real loss in biomass. It's certainly a loss in cover at the moment. You can see a lot of regrowth from fires down in towards southern Australia. And up in northern Australia, there's a little tinge of green, which is a kind of a known greening that's happening up in Cape York. Let's just sort of jump into I really like these sparse environments. So this is me going for a drive down the road. Whether it comes across in the video or not, I don't know. But this is out near Quilpie in central Queensland. And I'm driving down a road, sort of looking at in this case, Gidgee. It's an acacia community along the edge. This is the CCI biomass product out along that road, and you can see there's 2 dots there, but most of the time there's no retrieval. So there's a couple of retrievals where you've got fairly dense acacia, but not much elsewhere. Jedi biomass, you've got a 1 kilometre grid cell, so it's very coarse, and it is, most of the time picking up that there is something happening there, but it's a bit too coarse to be useful for local scale work. Flint Pro, once again, because it uses that sort of national forest cover data set, it works pretty well. It's picking up all those acacia communities quite well. It's not picking up the really sparse areas particularly well, but it's pretty good. And this is the biomass, so based on Sentinel-1 and 2. And it would appear to be overdoing it a little bit in some cases. A lot of those areas are down around the 1, basically the retrieval limit under 1 tonne per hectare. But if you sort of look along the road where you're driving along, there actually is, in most cases, obviously there's clay pans there, but in most cases there is, shrub and tree cover of around the order of around 1 tonne per hectare. So there is tree cover there, but it's just not sort of showing up. Why would you want to retrieve cover in these areas, though? That's kind of the question. I'll just run past Trend. The reason is that landholders are kind of interested now. Landholders, banks, and insurance companies, non-government organisations, they're kind of getting interested in this story around woody change, but also around forest carbon stocks and how that impacts on sustainability in the longer term, but also in the trading opportunities. So these sort of graphs that you can see here, the top one being, woody change and looking at the dynamics between primary and secondary forest, and the bottom graph, which is showing the change in forest carbon stock over time. For this particular farm, there was a large clearing event that happened in 2005, and you can see that loss of forest carbon, and it's been regrowing ever since. But these are the sort of reports that actually landholders want to pay for, that insurance companies want to pay for, that banks want to pay for due diligence. And so we kind of need to get it right in these sparse areas. If you look at a sort of a regional scale, and this is around the Brigalow belt, there's a lot of sort of dynamics happening across the landscape. So these areas here, they're acacia communities in most cases. Some of them have got eucalypt, poplar box. And it's exactly the same map. One's got Google Maps underneath and one is just black, but you can see the red areas are where we're seeing a significant loss in biomass over the last 5 years, and the green is where there's an increase in biomass. And these areas do get cleared, and then they regrow, and the farmers will then knock the brigalow over again for feed. And so in terms of sort of how a farmer's performing against the region, there's interest, I guess, in these sort of regional comparison plots as well, where you've got one farm or an aggregate of farms, and you compare them to the regional area to see, in this case here, the aggregated farms removed a lot more carbon in general than the surrounding area, but it started to, I guess, come back a bit more rapidly due to a change in management. So just to sort of finish off, I guess, on some of the future requirements, which from my sort of limited perspective I see as being important, is that there are an increasing number of landholders, private organisations, so those banks and insurance companies I talked about earlier, and NGOs such as WWF, and in Australia, the Meat and Livestock Association. So they're really interested in biomass dynamics and the verifiable frameworks that come from having these products available. We've also had a bit of an issue in Australia recently around Australia's emission reduction fund, and it's been called on to sort of lower measurement error. There's been some problems around human-induced regeneration and whether that is really happening, and the only way we can sort of get a handle on that is less error in products. There's also a couple of CRCs going on. So the Food Agility CRC is looking at assessing changes in biomass at annual to decadal scales. But in order for producers to take that up, we need to separate those into climate and management-driven processes, which means getting a good time series of biomass. And as you can see from those earlier maps, fire and drought have a huge effect in the Australian landscape, and we still don't know what's happening up north with carbon dioxide in this, 420 parts per million landscape. So how can the whole story is around, how you can separate the human influence on biomass from the climatic influences. Anyway, I'll stop there and hand it back to Richard.